All right, what?
If you want, we can do a video about one of your famous stories. If you have any famous ones.
Oh, let me think. Yeah, one of the stories I can tell you is about the sail when we were sailing a 68-foot sailboat, 68-foot sailboat, 13 meter, across the Gulf Stream to the Bahamas. Are you recording now? Okay. I was first mate on a 68-foot cruising 12-meter named Inara, and my mother and father were crew, and a couple of friends that I had met in the Bahamas the year before, and they called me to come down and spend the winter with them and help them with this boat. They were the owner was a rich guy from Texas. In any case, not to make that a long story, he wanted us to take the boat over to the Bahamas. Now the boat is 68 feet long, about 12 feet wide, drew 9.5 feet of water. The mast was 85 feet high, and there was only 6 of us sailing the boat. So we leave in the late afternoon to sail all night to get across the Gulf Stream to the Carey Islands, and then we were going down to Nassau. Well, unbeknownst to us at the time, there was also a major sailboat race taking place, the Miami to Nassau race, and they have different categories. They have the Class A, which are boats over 60 feet long, the Class B boats, which are like 45 to 60 feet, and Class C with the small ones. And they left from Miami, and we left from Fort Lauderdale. And at first there was hardly any wind, so we had our mainsail up, and we were motoring. And so we run all night, and we get over to the Carey Islands, just coming on daylight. And the wind is shifting and starting to breeze up. Now, as I said, there's only 6 of us on the boat. We had at the main and a great big giant Jonesport. The Jonesport would be big enough to put a tent over this house practically. And so I said to Brad, the skipper, I said, we ought to shorten the sail. By that it means bring the main part way down and tie off in the boom. In other words, you're shortening the amount of square feet you've got up there to sail with. Because as the wind breezes up, you don't need all that extra sail. And also we were realizing as it started to get daylight that there were some boats ahead of us, big sailboats ahead of us, and some little bit smaller ones coming along behind us. So apparently what had happened is we just happened to be just behind the Class A boats and just ahead of the Class B boats. Well, one of those Class B boats belonged to Ted Turner. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but he was a very, he actually created, was it TNN? No, I don't remember. It was a sports channel on TV. But anyway, his boat was in the race, and he was a Class B boat. And apparently he was just behind us. Now he thought that we were in the race, and we were a Class A boat, and that he was catching one of the Class A boats. So he's doing everything his crew can to try to catch us. In the meantime, the wind breezed up, and we decided that instead of trying to get some of the sails down where we didn't have enough crew, that we would just wing it and head for Nassau and hope for the best. Well, it kept breezing up. Now the boat weighed 37 tons. So she was quite heavy. So what she managed to do, instead of going up over the waves as we picked up speed, she would just kind of go right through the waves. And that meant that the wave would break over the bow and wash down each side of the boat. We're heeled over a lot. Obviously, the sailboat, the more the wind blows, the more you tip over. And so we're doing about 14 knots. Now, that's really fast for a big sailboat. Moving. Well, Ted Turner's boat's back there about a half a mile, and they are thinking we are going to catch one of those Class A boats. we're up here hanging on for dear life, wondering if everything's going to hold together, because we had that more sail than we needed for that amount of wind. So the waves are washing over the boat. We're all hunkered down back in the cockpit. And so this is where we go from like 30 miles to get from Berry Islands over to New Providence, where the city of Nassau is. Now Nassau Harbor is a little narrow harbor to get into, and then it turns to the left and gets bigger, and cruise ships actually go in there. But anyway, I said to Brad, the skipper, I said, you know, we can't sail in through that entrance. I said, we're going too fast, we're not going to be able to, and the wind's going to get more behind us, and the only thing we can do is then turn around into the wind, so that when the sails are flat, then we can drop them. And I said, and if some poor little boats in the way, we'd go through them like a hot knife through butter. I mean, a big boat like that. And I said, we need to turn into the wind before we go in there and take the sails in. And remember now, I said it was good roll off. The waves are probably 8 to 10 feet high.
Wow.
So this is the plan. I was steering the boat. Brad's job was to go up by the mast and release the halyards, that the wires that hold the sails up, and let everything fall. And my father and another guy from Florida, and right now I forget his name, I think it was Mark. Their job was to go up forward, and as the boat came into the wind, to be sure that the Genoa, that's the head sail, came down on the deck of the boat and knocked down over the side of the bow and dragged in the water. So, remember now, we're going 14 knots, which is like 16 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And I said, Brad's up there by the mast, I'm on the helm, Dad and Mark are up forward on the foredeck, and there was a great big anchor lashed down on the deck. I mean, it would hardly fit on the top of this table. And so Mark says, I'll go over there by that anchor, because I can always grab onto that and hang on, so that if the bow goes through a wave and the wave comes aft, it won't wash him overboard. And Dad said, I'm going to go up, and he said, I'll just hang on to the headstay. And his job was to pull on the sail once Brad released the halyard, so that it would all come down. Mark's job was to make sure that it all came down on deck and get it all gathered up. So I said, okay, ready? Yeah, and I was watching the waves, and as you know, in the ocean, there'll be a series of big waves, and then there'll be a series of smaller ones. They oscillate like that. So we went through some really big ones. I said, okay, looks like they get smaller. I turned her into the wind, and she went right through the first wave. My father was my size. He was hanging out of the headstay. The wave went right over his shoulders. The only thing of him that stayed out of the water was his head. Mark saw it coming. He dropped down on deck and grabbed that anchor because it was lashed down and hung on. And he just disappeared in the foam. The water went right over it. I'm hollering, Brad, let the halyards go. And just as he reaches over to throw the levers to release them so that they're like spools of wire, the wave hit him and knocked him off his feet and washed him all the way back to the cockpit. So now we're going like this into the waves. The sails are flapping all over the place. And finally, Brad crawls back up there, reaches up, releases the halyards, and we did get the sails down. Of course, once that happened, we slowed right down.
Yeah.
And I had the engine running. And so we pay off and we go in the harbor and get tied up. And we hadn't even gotten in there. And the captain of Ted Turner's boat and another guy hopped in that little rubber dinghy with him and came over to see. He said, what happened to you guys? Why did you take your sails down before you came across the finish line? And I said, what do you mean? He said, this is the Miami-Nassau race. Aren't you in this race? And I said, no. We're just delivering the boat to the Bahamas. And he said, well, I just destroyed probably $20,000 worth of sails and stuff on my boat to try to catch up with you guys. And just before you get there, you turn into the wind, take your sails down and motor in. So that was probably the most exciting sailing that we have ever done.